August 480 BC. King Xerxes of Persia wants to add Greece to his vast Eastern Empire. If he succeeds, Western civilization will be crushed in its cradle, and with it the fragile new ideas of freedom and democracy. The Greeks have one chance to stop Xerxes in his tracks at the narrow pass of Thermopylae. King Leonidas and just 300 of his elite Spartan warriors plan to lead the Greek defense. Their fight against Xerxes will be one of the greatest battles of all time. The Spartans at the gates of fire. 2,500 years ago, Greek valleys teemed with Persian invaders. Armies of men and their beasts drank Greek rivers dry. Vast fleets shadowed the Greek coast. King Xerxes of Persia harbored a desire to expand the borders of his empire into Greece. His father before him had tried and failed. Now it was his turn. Xerxes was taking no risks. He had assembled an army of staggering proportions. The Greek historian Herodotus claimed it was more than 2 million men. Already he had conquered northern Greece. Now he was heading for the powerful city-states of Athens and Sparta in the south.
It was certainly a minority opinion in Greece that there was any possibility that the Persian Empire would lose this one. They simply had so many men, they had such force that they could bring to bear, that most Greeks assumed that any resistance might be heroic, but would certainly be futile.
But in the south, an alliance of Greek states led by King Leonidas of Sparta had chosen to resist.
The king's dignity, the dignity of his community as independent people, rested on driving these Persians away. There was no dignified future under Persian rule.
But the Spartans usually hated fighting abroad. They had a massive population of slaves called helots they had to control at home.
You've got 250,000 helots that need to be watched continuously. What happens when an army's outside Sparta? Sparta had a problem always of a small population. You can't send 300, 400, or 500 elites and have them killed without upsetting the precious balance between free and helot.
But with Xerxes' Persian army thundering south, Leonidas had no choice. Some of Sparta's elite warriors would have to go north.
The Spartans probably thought that if they didn't send anyone, that no Greeks would go, that Sparta as the leading military state, and with the military leadership, the land leadership in its hands, had to set an example.
Only 300 hardened fighters were chosen to go with Leonidas to head off Xerxes' hordes.
Most people believe that there was 300 as an advance guard that would show Spartan intent, seriousness, and then if it went well, they would send back word and more Spartans would come. But I think everybody would have known that anybody who goes north and marches up to northern Greece to face an army that was anywhere from 100 to 200,000 soldiers knows they're going to die.
Despite the danger, they set off without hesitation.
The average Spartan was trained to obey, so when Leonidas said, go to Thermopylae, the average Spartan would have said, "Righto, sir," and would have picked up his kit, or rather ordered his helot to pick up his kit, and off he would have went.
In early August 480 BC, King Leonidas, 300 Spartans, and an unknown number of Helot slaves left their sacred homeland and set off for Thermopylae.
When they left their families, they would have had doubts, they would have not wanted to die, but far more common would be the idea that this is an important event, it's a glorious event, it's something to be happy about. Psychologically, they had it ingrained to them again and again and again that their whole social capital depended on how well they performed on the battlefield.
Women were actually out there ordering their men to come home victorious. The famous saying of the Spartan wife is "with it or on it," meaning that her husband must come home with his shield or dead on it, and certainly not come home as a deserter.
All Spartans were trained killers, but the 300 were not just picked for their ability on the battlefield.
There was a special requirement made for the men who were picked to fight at Thermopylae. They had to be fathers of sons. Perhaps the Spartans felt that a father with sons had already done their duty for the future of Sparta. These men were almost expendable.
As they marched north, the Spartans knew that the odds were against them, but they entrusted their fate to their gods. The most religious people in Greece, they always took herds of sacrificial animals with them, so they could read the omens for battle in the shape of the animals' livers.
Normally before a battle, if the liver wasn't the right shape, Spartans wouldn't start the fight. And then the fight wouldn't start, because a Greek enemy would never provoke the Spartans to war. This time, it wasn't up to the Spartans when the battle started. They were on the defense.
Leonidas was venturing into the unknown. Fighting the army of the Persian Empire would not be like fighting other Greeks. From the outset, the omens were not good. Legend says that he turned to the greatest fortune teller in Greece for advice, the oracle at Delphi. She foretold that a Spartan king must die to save Sparta. If this part of the legend was true, Thermopylae was a suicide mission. But perhaps their cause wasn't as hopeless as it might have seemed. Inspired by their example, other city-states rallied to the cause. Athens had already agreed to send its formidable navy, while other allies such as Thebes and Thespes swelled the infantry ranks to over 4,000. Even so, according to the account given by the Greek historian Herodotus, the Spartans and their allies were still outnumbered by over 500 to 1 by land and 3 to 1 at sea. By the middle of August 480 BC, steep mountains rose before them. They had reached Thermopylae. Hot springs poured down the mountainside, giving Thermopylae its name, Termopilai, the hot gates, the gates of fire. No one knows exactly what Thermopylae was like in Leonidas's time, but the sea was said to come up to the mountains, leaving only a narrow path along the coast. A small army could block it with ease. A natural bottleneck, Thermopylae was the last defendable position on Xerxes' road to Athens. The Greek plan was simple. They intended to block the way south along a defensive line that stretched from Thermopylae on land across a narrow channel of water to the island of Artemisium. Holding the line by sea was the Athenian navy. Defending it by land were the Spartans. Leonidas ordered his men to block Thermopylae's coastal path. They started by rebuilding an old defensive wall. His plan was to turn the pass at Thermopylae into a narrow funnel of death, creating a killing zone, which he hoped would trap and neutralize the Persians' vast numerical superiority. Next, Leonidas addressed the one potential weakness in the plan. Known only to the local Greeks, there was a secret track that led over the mountains to behind the Spartan position. Anxious to keep his own troops on the front line, Leonidas took a gamble and sent only a small contingent of Phocian allies to guard it. With the battle plan now in place, the waiting game began. For King Leonidas, Thermopylae was not just a good defensive position. It was a place of real personal significance. Leonidas believed that he was a direct descendant of the son of Zeus, Heracles, who spent his last days at Thermopylae.
When Leonidas goes to Thermopylae, he's conscious that over the hot spring is a massive altar of his own great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Heracles. Behind him is Mount Oita, which is the place where Heracles actually died. He sacrificed himself on the top of the mountain towering over Thermopylae. Down below, where the ships are moored on Cape Sepias, that is where Heracles, no less, was put off to collect water by Jason and the Argonauts. Heracles' presence is everywhere, and he is actually an ancestor.
Meanwhile, Xerxes' 250,000-strong Persian army was well fed, from stockpiles of rations dispatched by special boats months earlier. As they advanced inexorably through northern Greece, city after city paid homage, supplying dinner and entertainment for the great king and up to 15,000 members of his close royal circle. By late August 480 BC, Xerxes reached Thermopylae, and still no sword had been raised against him. Now, thousands of Persian campfires ranged across the plains to the north of Leonidas's position. All that separated the two armies was Thermopylae's narrow coastal path.
When Xerxes got to Thermopylae, he did not seek battle as soon as he arrived. He waited, and he waited. We're told in the end that he waited until the 5th day. And the reason why he was waiting was because he simply could not believe that a puny Greek force, when it saw the full might of Persia, would not simply turn tail and run.
Spartans were trained never to run from a fight. Herodotus, the first Greek historian, tells of a Greek scout who saw the massed Persian hordes and fled back to the Spartan camp, where a warrior called Dionysus was standing guard.
He tells that the Persians are so numerous that when their archers fire a volley, the shafts literally block out the sun. And Dionysus says, "Good, then we'll have our battle in the shade."
Although some of the other Greeks wanted to leave, under Leonidas's watchful eye, the allies stood firm. On the other side of Thermopylae, the Persians had now been waiting for the Greeks to surrender for 3 days. According to Herodotus, Xerxes grew impatient and sent a spy to the Greek camp. He was baffled by their refusal to be intimidated by his army. The spy came across a group of Spartans performing a bizarre ritual.
Spartans happened to be dressing their hair, and they paid no attention to him whatsoever. They let him ride up, check them out, and ride back. He was completely stunned. So was Xerxes when he got that these soldiers seemed to be treating him with absolute contempt.
To be seen combing their hair in the face of the enemy was a sign that they were not frightened. And that was one of the Spartans' chief weapons in war. We do not fear you. It is for you to run away.
On the fifth morning, Xerxes decided to put an end to this strange Greek behavior. He gave the order for his men to advance. Short of victory, he took up a position overlooking the battlefield. Scribes prepared to note down who fought well and deserved reward, and who did badly and should be punished. Unlike Xerxes, Leonidas marched to war beside his men. Against the Persians, Spartan training and discipline would be tested to the limit. Battle-hardened comrades placed their lives in each other's hands once again. The first troops the Persians sent to face the Greeks were amongst their weakest. Ill-equipped, they were ordered to squeeze into the narrow pass and advance towards the Spartans. Leonidas and his men packed tightly together, blocking the pass with a phalanx formation. Lines of men with spears bristling above overlapping shields. When the two narrow front lines collided, the Persians soon found that their short javelins and wicker shields were no match for disciplined Spartans armed with 9-foot spears.
So you really have kind of a chopping machine that is simply moving forward almost blindly. When a line of Spartans confronted a line of more lightly armed soldiers, it was absolutely bloody. It was really like feeding meat into a meat grinder.
Leonidas' choice of Thermopylae was working well.
The important thing about Thermopylae is this enormous mountain flank rising. One of the great problems for the Persians, brilliantly utilized by Leonidas, was that half of them actually fell off and fell over into the shoals below before they could even fight.
But as rank after rank of the Persian army fell, it soon became clear that they had vastly underestimated Spartan military prowess.
Had they been fighting on the open plains on horseback, it would have been another story. But in these narrow confines, the Greek heavy armor, the massed phalanx, the Persians didn't have an answer to that. And I'm sure the Greeks were just slaughtering them by, it's almost as fast as they could plunge their spears over their shoulders.
Trapped in the narrow pass, the advancing Persian troops were being annihilated, unable to take advantage of their vastly superior numbers.
When Xerxes looked at this, the first thing he would see, literally thousands of warriors that he couldn't use because the nature of the pass was so narrow. The problem he must have very quickly noticed was that he sends people down this corridor, they kill him, he sends people down, they kill him. There was no end to it.
Frustrated, by late afternoon, Xerxes decided to send in the cream of his army to unblock the pass. An elite force that included members of his own family. Some 10,000 strong, the Greeks called them immortals. As soon as one man was killed, another immediately took his place. But even Persia's elite troops were no match for the Spartans. As the two crack forces closed in on each other, the Spartans performed an audacious countermaneuver. In the middle of the battle, they pretended to retreat.
One of the interesting things about Thermopylae is, for the first and perhaps the only occasion in classical Greek history, we hear of a feigned withdrawal. The Spartans would approach the enemy and then in lockstep and on order backpedal, drawing the Persians in which they would then suddenly form a rigid line and kill them even more easily as they were out of order and undisciplined. Usually it was considered beyond the realm of Greek tactics. Why did it happen at Thermopylae? Probably a combination of Spartan discipline and the nature of the pass. It was narrow. If they were to do that in a regular battlefield, they might easily be outflanked.
Stunned by the ever-mounting losses, Xerxes ordered the immortals to retreat. As the day drew to a close, Leonidas and his allies had triumphed against all the odds.
They must have felt vindicated. Everything that they had been taught, that they were superior because of their tremendous discipline, seemed at that moment to be true. And even though they must have recognized that this can't go on forever, the feeling of their demonstrated superiority against the biggest empire in the known world must have been a source of a great deal of pride.
In the Persian camp, after his bad day, Xerxes was reeling.
Thermopylae must have been an enormously frustrating experience for Xerxes. He'd waited days expecting the Spartans to retreat, and they hadn't. He'd lost thousands of men when he shouldn't have done. And to cap all of that, he lost 2 of his own brothers. He was emotionally absolutely exhausted, and Herodotus tells us, incredibly angry.
Troops who had fought poorly are said to have paid the ultimate price. Xerxes' navy had also suffered. Opposite Thermopylae, the Athenian fleet had sunk many Persian ships, keeping Leonidas safe from sea attack. According to Herodotus, although they knew next to nothing about naval warfare, a Spartan had been appointed admiral of the Athenian fleet. The logic for this appointment was simple.
The Spartan admiral would not know a great deal, probably, about maneuvering in detail. That was Athenian territory. But that kind of maneuvering wasn't what was planned. The fleet opposite Thermopylae was to be static. It was to block. Its main aim was not to run away. And if there's one thing the Spartans were good at, it was not running away.
As the second day of battle dawned, Xerxes tried to break the deadlock once again. But the Spartan infantry continued its killing spree to devastating effect. As the day wore on, the pass at Thermopylae became a cauldron of death, piled high with mutilated and rotting Persian corpses.
The smell, blood, feces, plus the hot sun corrupting what was left and producing an even worse smell, it just doesn't bear thinking about.
At the end of the second day, Xerxes was facing the stark reality that his greatest resource, numerical superiority, counted for nothing.
He's very quickly coming to his senses that these Greeks fight better and kill his men, and there doesn't seem any solution to this problem that he got himself into, that numbers for the first time in his life don't mean anything. If numbers for a Persian king don't mean anything, you have no other resources to draw on.
Persian numbers may have meant nothing, but Persian gold still counted for a lot. According to Herodotus, a local Greek called Ephialtes came forward and offered to sell information to Xerxes that could win him the battle.
The attractions of Persian gold, which we're told by Herodotus is what induced him to betray the Greeks, was well known in Greek history to exert a mesmerizing effect on Greeks, and that was one of the ways in which Persia traditionally controlled Greek city-states, by dishing out lots of cash.
It's said that in return for gold, Ephialtes showed the Persians the Anopia Pass that led round to the back of the Spartan position.
The pass was well known. It was inevitable. Somebody was going to tell the Persians of its existence. There were so many locals who were backing Xerxes. They wanted the Persians to win and couldn't stand the Spartans.
10,000 immortals marched up the secret pass. All that stood in their way was a contingent of Phocians, local Greeks who didn't have the benefit of Spartan training.
There's some 1,000 of them, and they only have one order, that is, make sure that the pass is not turned. And what happens? Ephialtes leads the Persians around to the rear of Leonidas. The Phocians see them, they panic, they go up to the heights, and in the process they leave the pass open.
The Phocians took one look at them and scrambled off like rabbits and let the Persian force through.
As Xerxes' immortals set off up the steep mountain pass, Leonidas would also have been seeking a means of ending the deadlock. "500 years after the battle, a Roman historian suggested that Leonidas might have tried guerrilla tactics to win the war at a stroke. Years of hunting rebellious Helot slaves at night meant the Spartans had the skills to assassinate Xerxes under cover of darkness.
The notion of knocking out the one man who holds together this disparate force is not entirely implausible. The Spartans were the masters of knight behavior. Of all Greeks, a small squadron of Spartans might just conceivably have been able to get as near to Xerxes as this source says they did, and conceivably even assassinate Xerxes in his tent.
Herodotus does not mention the raid, but to me it's one of those stories that if it didn't happen, it should have happened. It certainly would make sense that someone would come forward and say, let me take a crack at this. And from Leonidas's point of view, why not?
If an attempt was made to assassinate Xerxes, it failed. By morning, the immortals would have crossed the mountain path and be marching towards the Greek position from the rear. The Spartans and their allies were surrounded. As day 3 of the battle loomed, the Spartans and their king were determined to hold fast. Even now, retreat or surrender was unthinkable.
I don't see any genuine choices for Leonidas and his Spartans at that point, nor do I suppose that they really have wanted a choice. That's almost an Athenian thought, that you should have a choice at this moment of crisis. I think it's a Spartan thought to look you in the eye and say, there is no choice. It's simply a matter of duty.
But Leonidas did not expect his allies to be bound by the same standards as the Spartans. According to Herodotus' history, Leonidas allowed the other Greek allies to retreat. But for a small band of Thebans and Thespians who decided to stay, the Spartans would face the enemy alone.
This was the moment that they had been born for. In my opinion, Leonidas knew exactly what he was doing, knew exactly the myth that he was creating at this moment. And I think all the other 300 knew it too.
The Spartans prepared for battle with their usual sacrifices. According to Herodotus, the omens were clear. Even the gods had deserted them now.
We hear that when the Spartans sacrificed an animal before their final engagement, the omens were bad. And if Spartans started their fighting that day, knowing that the omens were wrong, they would be anticipating their own deaths. The gods had warned them not to fight.
Just as the Delphic oracle had foreseen, a Spartan king would die fighting Persia. All that remained was for Leonidas to die well.
When you're going to be surrounded, the question is how do you want to die and how long do you want to die and how many people you want to take with them. So I think that was the Spartan new idea, that it wasn't to save Greece. It was now simply to make a statement about Greek courage and to prolong the Persian agony as much as possible.
As a Spartan and as a king, Leonidas was above all a professional soldier, and he was above all a commander of men. And so at the final moment when push came to shove, Leonidas would not have had a shadow of doubt as to where his duty lay.
At the head of his few remaining men, Leonidas faced the Persians one last time. Surrounded, he could no longer defend the pass, so he led his troops in a final attack, killing as many Persians as possible. But he could never kill enough. Leonidas's life had been brutal. His death was glorious. Despite losing their leader, the remaining Spartans fought on, determined to make the Persians pay dearly for every last drop of Greek blood. Even if they had to fight without weapons.
After their spears were broken or got lost, the Spartans resorted to their swords, which was most unusual. After the same happened to their swords, Herodotus tells us that they fought with anything they had, with their teeth, with their fingernails.
Even then, when their swords were broken, their spears were gone, and they were reduced to their hands and teeth, a Spartan was not an animal that any Persian wanted to come close to. Herodotus describes the Persian attack on them with a verb that indicates arrows.
To die under a hail of arrows would be perhaps worse than dying with a spear in your groin. So the Spartans were taught to abuse arrows. They were taught to see them as attractoi, as spindles, as women's things.
According to Herodotus, not a single Spartan survived the Battle of Thermopylae. The victorious Persians found Leonidas's body among the piles of dead and took it to Xerxes.
Xerxes took the very unusual step of getting hold of the corpse of Leonidas, beheading it and sticking the head on a pike. Now, that kind of behaviour wasn't altogether unheard of in the ancient world, but the Persians didn't normally do it. They honoured men who distinguished themselves in battle. They saw them as true heroes and tended to respect their corpses enormously. Xerxes did this because he was really, really angry.
What happened to Leonidas was quite sad because they hide the other bodies, so the heroism, all of the physical evidence of the battlefield will be hidden. And then they literally set up a tourist bureau and have boats to bring over other Greeks so that they see this hideous, grotesque head of a Spartan king on a stake as a sign that Persia is superior to the Greeks.
The line had not been held. Xerxes' troops descended on Athens and burnt it to the ground.
Tactically, Thermopylae was the worst defeat in the history of Sparta. Strategically, it was a wonderful victory. How can that be possible? The pass was turned, the fleet withdrew, but it was the psychological drama that Greeks had held off the Persian Empire, not just the Persian army, for 3 days. And that gave enormous psychological capital to the defenders to the rear.
Inspired by the Spartans' heroic stand, the Greek forces regrouped to the south. Within a year, the Athenian navy would defeat Xerxes' fleet, and the Persian king would be forced into a humiliating retreat. Xerxes withdrew to Persia, never to return.
If the Persians had won, there would have been no democracy in Athens. If there'd been no democracy in Athens, there would have been no Athenian politics, no Athenian theatre, no Athenian philosophy. An awful lot of what we call our cultural heritage would simply never have happened.
The events at Thermopylae would change the course of history forever. Greek culture and civilization were able to flourish. But Sparta's harsh warrior cult would survive for less than 100 years. Their helot slaves successfully revolted, and Sparta's dominance came to an end. Only the legend lives on.
Sparta really was, in many ways, a nightmarish society. It was capable of a moment of self-sacrifice that one has to respect. And yet, if we embrace the values that I see Sparta standing for, I think we've lost everything that really matters about freedom. And yet, maybe that freedom wasn't possible without that moment at Termopylae. It's an odd thought.